Once upon a time, HTC was one of the biggest smartphone producers in the entire world. In fact, in 2011, they were the third largest phone manufacturer in the entire world, only beaten out by Apple and Samsung themselves. Within the US, HTC was even ahead of Samsung as the go-to Android phone maker with a market share of 24%. But ever since then, it's only been straight down for HTC. In fact, you now need two leading zeros to describe their global market share of just 0.09%. Even the revived Nokia brand has 5 times the market share. Within just 4 years, HTC's revenue dropped from $6 billion to less than $2 billion. And their net income? Well, that went from barely being profitable to heavily being in the red, losing hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. HTC would eventually end up selling a large portion of themselves to Google out of desperation, but this too hasn't led anywhere. Things are so bad that rumors about HTC shutting down their smartphone business altogether have been flying around for years now. It's easy to write off this massive decline as just a result of Apple and Samsung dominating the market and becoming a duopoly, but there's a lot more to the story. You see, much of HTC's decline can be explained by HTC's own decisions, but not in the way that you might think. With a company like Yahoo or Xerox, for example, their leadership simply made the wrong choice altogether. With HTC though, their leadership often actually made the right choices, but the competition simply made even better choices. In fact, during the early part of their decline, HTC was actually putting up record numbers year after year. It's just that the competition was putting up even more impressive record numbers. So it's not necessarily that HTC went down, but rather that they simply couldn't keep up. The smartphone industry simply continued to explode without them, and over time, this destroyed them from the outside in. So join me as we take a look back at the monstrous rise and fall of one of the OG smartphone producers, HTC. Taking a look back, the story of HTC can be traced all the way back to May 15, 1997 to Taiwan, a full decade ahead of the iPhone. The name HTC Corporation actually stands for High Tech Computer Corporation, and HTC definitely tried to live up to this name. In fact, most of their efforts over the years went into trying to innovate and create the next big thing. For example, in 1998, they would begin designing one of the world's first touchscreen smartphones. And they weren't just trying to make a smarter mobile phone either. The real goal was to make a full-fledged handheld computer that ran Windows, and they would succeed too. In 2002, they would launch the world's first Windows-powered smartphone. But not only did HTC launch the world's first Windows smartphones, but they would go on to launch the world's first Android smartphone, the T-Mobile G1, also known as the HTC Dream. HTC wasn't just innovating with smartphones either, they were very much pushing forward the entire mobile industry. In 2005, they helped popularize 3G, and just a few years later, they would help popularize 4G with the launch of America's first 4G phone, the HTC Evo 4G. Hearing all this, I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that HTC was named as one of the most innovative companies in the world in 2010. As a modern tech company in a rapidly evolving and highly competitive industry such as smartphones, you would think that this is precisely the mindset that you would need. The mindset to constantly innovate and push forward. After all, isn't that what Apple did? Well, not exactly. You see, Apple's real innovations were not in technology itself. With most smartphone technologies, Android usually does it first, and it's not till years later that Apple does the same thing. But it's completely different when Apple does it, because Apple's real innovation is often not in the technology itself, but actually in how the technology is delivered. For example, how Apple made Face ID so reliable that you could seamlessly use it dozens of times every day and not even notice. How they made bite-sized Bluetooth headphones that not only provided a strong listening experience, but also practical battery life. How they make it a breeze to take professional-level pictures and videos. Apple's real innovative power is not in creating new technologies, but rather taking existing technologies and making them effortless. HTC, on the other hand, was truly just working on creating new technologies. For example, the HTC Evo 3D was the first phone to leverage dual rear cameras, something that was copied by Apple and everyone else. Similarly, the HTC Thunderbolt was the first LTE-enabled phone, years before Apple and everyone else. And the HTC M7 was the first aluminum unibody phone, something that was oddly familiar to the iPhone 6. But while these innovations may have spoken to tech enthusiasts, the same cannot be said about the general public. When it came to the general public, Apple and Samsung's approach of packaging technologies and innovating experiences was simply far more effective. But as we know, Apple themselves wasn't able to keep up with this forever. Eventually, they did start dropping the ball. The iPhone 15, for example, is likely their most uninspiring launch of all time. But none of this is really hurting Apple because they diversified. And it's not that HTC didn't try diversifying themselves, but let's just say it didn't go nearly as well for them. iPhone sales have been declining for years now. In fact, Apple doesn't even want to reveal how many units they're moving nowadays. But this hasn't hurt their bottom line at all because they've been able to diversify. Instead of monetizing the sale of iPhones, Apple has moved towards monetizing other parts of the smartphone business like the use of the iPhone. Similarly, Samsung has seen a lot of success as a background player within the smartphone industry. Most people know Samsung for their Galaxy and Note phones, but Samsung is actually one of the biggest background players within the smartphone industry, dominating the display and flash memory markets. In fact, iPhone screens themselves are made by Samsung. So clearly, there's a lot of money to be made through strategic diversification, and HTC knew it. In fact, they've been trying to do similar diversification efforts for over a decade now, but it hasn't quite played out the same way. For example, in 2011, they decided to increase their control over the hardware space by purchasing S3 Graphics for $300 million. S3 Graphics had made strides within the 3D industry and held hundreds of critical patents that had been licensed out to Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft for their gaming consoles. So HTC figured that they could take over S3 Graphics and become a licensing giant within the smartphone graphics industry. Google was making a similar play around the same time with Motorola. They spent $12.5 billion to acquire Motorola, and more specifically, their 14,600 patents. And they would use these patents to successfully defend themselves against Apple's lawsuits against Android, making the acquisition a massive success. HTC was likely hoping that they could pull off a similar victory against Apple, but unfortunately for them, the court would end up siding with Apple, and S3 would just end up fading into oblivion after that. Fortunately, HTC was working on other diversification efforts as well, like Beats by Dre. Years before Apple got involved, HTC invested $300 million into Beats in 2011 and acquired a majority stake in the company. But as HTC's fundamentals started declining, they decided to cash in on this investment prematurely, selling for a mere $56 million profit. Just 1 year after this, Apple would end up buying Beats for $3 billion. Talk about bad timing from HTC. Obviously, HTC did not have much luck with the music industry, but one industry where they were not only early but stuck around till the end was streaming. HTC actually made 2 separate streaming-related investments, the first of which was a game streaming company called OnLive. OnLive was basically an early version of Google Stadia, and it already had big players backing them, including BT, Warner Brothers, and AT&T. Like Google Stadia though, OnLive didn't end up working out, and they would end up shutting down in early 2015. Fortunately, HTC's other streaming-related acquisition was going much better, Saffron Digital. Saffron Digital specialized in creating and hosting the infrastructure used by players like the NBA, NFL, NHL, Paramount, NBC, and Sony. But after getting stung by OnLive, HTC would decide to de-risk when it came to streaming, and Saffron would end up getting acquired by New Line. Honestly, it was probably a good idea to focus back on their core product and start turning things around, but unfortunately, this turnaround never came. More than innovating the wrong things and failing to diversify, likely the #1 factor that dragged down HTC was lackluster marketing. And again, just like their innovation and diversification efforts, it's not that HTC was against marketing. In fact, they were all for marketing, budgeting as much as $1 billion for individual campaigns. They locked in A-list celebrities like Robert Downey Jr., paying him $12 million for just a 2-minute commercial. But while HTC was on board with all of this, I think they made one fatal flaw, which was considering their brand positioning more carefully. It seems that HTC approached the whole branding side of things a bit too logically. They basically thought, okay, we have a solid set of products at reasonable prices. If we simply put this in front of people with huge marketing spend, we should be selling out in no time. But the reality is that marketing isn't so logical, especially in the modern age. More and more people tend to prioritize how a brand makes them feel as opposed to what a brand is offering them on paper. This is precisely why Apple's marketing is so effective. They're not selling the iPhone spec sheet or its value proposition. They're selling feelings, the feeling of premiumness with their material choices and sleek designs, the feeling of exclusivity with their high prices and strategic market positioning, and most importantly, the feeling of inclusion with iMessage and FaceTime and now even phone calls. These feelings are what sell the iPhones and Galaxies, not the spec sheet. And this is a massive departure from how things used to be before 2000, as people usually just made purchase decisions based on who could give them the best bang for the buck. That's why companies like Sony and Panasonic were so popular. They made strong, reliable products for a reasonable price, and that's why people bought their products, as simple as that. But trying to apply this legacy strategy to the smartphone industry simply didn't work, and I think this is what really screwed over HTC on all fronts. In terms of innovation, HTC was looking to buff up the spec sheet and pack in the best technology possible, when the real solution was to create the best experience possible. In terms of diversification, they stuck to fundamentals. S3 graphics, for example, seemed like a safe patent play, and they sold off Beats because they got a reasonable offer. There was no way to expect that Apple would pay $3 billion for Beats because it wasn't fundamentally worth that much. But Apple was okay with paying that for non-fundamental reasons. And in terms of marketing, HTC was very much willing to put their money where their mouth was. But their objective approach simply didn't resonate with the general public. The reality was that HTC was always trying to make the objectively right choice. But the truth is that it's often the intangibles that make a company truly successful. And without those intangibles, HTC simply couldn't stand the test of time. With historically high interest rates, the appeal of bills and bonds is higher than ever, yet traditional brokerages haven't really adapted with the times. They still expect people to use clunky bond tables, scroll through long overwhelming lists, and even use virtual keyboards till recently. And that's why we created our own modern bond platform, Silo. At Silo, we prioritize the user experience and the ease of finding and investing in the issuers you know and trust, so that you too can easily lock in high yields. Also, choosing a strong user experience does not mean sacrificing on safety. Every Silo account is insured by $500,000 in SIPC insurance and $2.5 million in FDIC insurance. Also, all funds deposited on the platform will be maintained by our trusted custodian, Interactive Brokers, who has experience managing $373 billion worth of assets over the past 45 years. So, if you're looking for a modern way to invest in bonds, please consider checking out Silo in the description below. Unlike HTC, Samsung actually ended up winning the smartphone game, but they're not doing all that well anyway. Check out this video to learn more, but until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.